Hi everyone, welcome to Healthier Holiday Treats 2020. This is actually our 7th year doing this class, so we have lots of ideas on our website. You can find it on Cookwell Berkeley under Recipes by Class. But today I'm going to show you a few more ideas. In the past, this class was about both gifts and things that you could bring to a holiday party, but since we're not really doing holiday parties this year, I'm going to focus on homemade gifts that you can make. So the first one we're going to make is called Furikake Chex Mix. And if you're wondering where the recipes are, they're in the BCal. And if you're watching this when it's recorded, then it'll be on our website on Cookwell Berkeley. So this snack mix is something that a lot of people in my family like to make. And it's really easy. And I've there's a lot of different versions out there. But this one is one that I've made. It's a little bit less sweet than the other versions because I like it more savory. So let me tell you about the ingredients. So the first thing is this. This is called furikake. It's a Japanese seasoning, and it usually has things like seaweed in it, sometimes salt, sugar, sesame seeds, and oftentimes actually has fish flakes. So if you want to make this vegetarian or vegan, make sure you find one that doesn't have fish in it. This one's actually from Trader Joe's and it doesn't have any fish. So this seasoning is often used to top rice like it shows in the picture there, but it can also be used on vegetables, seafood, popcorn, or whatever else you'd like. In this case, we're doing a snack mix. And it's full of umami flavor, which we talked about in the last cooking class, which was called Flavors Around the World. So you can watch that recording if you weren't able to attend. So you can even make your own version of this. If you've ever made dashi, which is like a Japanese broth, you can use the leftover to make furikake, or you can make it without fish. So this gift that we're making has whole grains in it. It has healthy fats, and again, it has that umami flavor. So let's go ahead and get started because it takes about an hour to bake. So it won't quite be done by the time this class ends, but I have some already made that I can show you. So the first thing you do is you preheat your oven to 250 degrees. So we're going to cook this at low heat for a long time. If you do too high of heat, then it's going to burn. So we just want to kind of dry it out. So I went ahead and measured out my cereal here. You basically want about 6 cups of something to then cover with your sauce. So in this case, I'm going to do 5 cups of cereal and a cup of nuts. And last time I did this, I used raw almonds. But since I just made that last week, I want to make a different version. So I'm going to use peanuts. But the peanuts I have are already roasted, so I'm not going to throw those in until a little later. So what we're going to do is we're going to make the sauce that's going to coat the cereal. So for this, we're going to just heat it in a saucepan and bring it to a boil so that everything's combined. So we're going to use a 1/4 cup of butter, and to make this recipe dairy-free and vegan, I'm going to use this non-dairy butter. But if you're okay with butter, then just fine to use that too. So 1 standard stick is 1/2 cup. So 1/4 cup will be just the amount we need. So I'll throw that in there. And then we're going to use 1/4 cup of agave. So you basically just want some kind of liquid sweetener here. You can also use honey or maple syrup. Honestly, I like to use agave just because it's one of the cheaper options of the liquid sweeteners. A lot of the traditional recipes use corn syrup, so that's probably even more affordable, so you could use that too. And then we're going to use some mild flavored oil. I happen to have this sunflower oil, which is totally fine to use. It says canola, but just some kind of mild oil. I wouldn't use olive oil, extra virgin olive oil in this because that flavor is a little bit stronger. Okay, so 1/4 cup of everything. 1/4 cup of butter, oil, agave. If you want this to be sweeter, you could add 1/4 cup of granulated sugar at this point. And then we're gonna add a little bit of soy sauce, which also gives us that umami flavor. We're gonna add 2 teaspoons. And between the butter and the soy sauce, we're not really gonna need any more salt. Oh, and the furikake has some salt in it too. Okay. So now we're just gonna bring this to a boil, which is just gonna take a couple minutes. So again, I already have my cereal here. I'm gonna add the nuts in a little bit, but you can kind of customize this however you want. I would just aim for about 6 cups of anything. So I'm using sort of a multi-grain cereal, but you could do half this type of cereal and half another type of cereal. You could add pretzels or goldfish or whatever you'd like to kind of make it a little bit more interesting. But I really actually like the texture of the cereal. So this is my favorite part of the mix. So I just make it with a lot of this. So a few notes on this. If you need this recipe to be vegetarian, just make sure you use the version that doesn't have fish in it. To make it vegan, do that and use vegan butter. And if you want to make this recipe wheat or gluten-free, you can use rice or corn or other gluten-free cereal. And for the soy sauce, just make sure that's gluten or wheat-free. I'm using reduced sodium tamari, which usually is gluten-free. Basically, it's like soy sauce without the wheat in it, and tastes just as good in my opinion. So this is kind of more of a savory gift. A lot of times around the holidays, we think about sweet gifts, which are totally fine, but sometimes you just want to switch it up and do something savory. So next question for the chat is, what kind of savory homemade gifts have you made or even received as a gift? And if you've made any other unique flavors of something that's sort of like a snack mix or Chex mix, we can put that in the chat as well. So while we're waiting for our mixture to boil, the butter's almost melted there. I was just going to tell you a little bit more about seaweed, since this might be sort of an unusual ingredient for you that maybe you haven't used a whole lot, but there are actually thousands of kinds of seaweed, but only a few dozen that are usually consumed. And generally, it's a rich source of vitamins, including vitamin K, rich source of minerals like calcium, magnesium, potassium, copper, and iron. And I can hear my syrup boiling, so let me stir that up. Okay, that's almost ready. Seaweed also has a high iodine content, especially the brown algae variety. And that's generally not a concern unless you happen to have an under or overactive thyroid. It also has soluble fiber and prebiotics, which may benefit the bacteria in your large intestine. And it comes from the sea, it's seaweed, so it can be contaminated with whatever is in the water. But most US-based companies that harvest seaweed regularly test for things like arsenic and heavy metals, as well as bacteria, pesticides, radiation. So a couple of good companies are Rising Tide Sea Vegetables and Maine Coast Sea Vegetables. The type of seaweed that's in this is called nori, N-O-R-I. It's a red seaweed, and actually it happens to be one of the least contaminated types of seaweed. So this is a fun way to incorporate a little bit into your diet and get that flavor and some of those nutrients. And we also have a recipe for wasabi nori chips on Cookwell Berkeley if you want to do something else with seaweed. Okay, so my oven's preheated. My sauce is all melted. It came to a little bit of a boil. So I'm going to just pour this over. I recommend using a rimmed baking sheet for this because you're going to be stirring it a few times throughout the cooking process. So it just makes it a lot easier to stir. You don't have to worry about it falling off the edges there. Okay, so I have a little bit on everything, and then we're going to add the furikake here. And we're going to add half a cup, so I'll just take this whole thing off. So this already has some seaweed. I mean, not seaweed. Has seaweed, also sesame seeds. But we're going to add just a little bit more because that's going to give it a nice crunch. We're just going to add a tablespoon, and I'm going to eyeball it because it doesn't have to be exact. And that's pretty much it. We're just going to give it a good stir, get everything coated, and then we're going to pop it in the oven to get it to dry out. And you're going to stir it every 15 minutes. And it's going to stay pretty wet throughout this process. I find that it still looks wet when I take it out of the oven, but then once it cools down, it hardens and it'll stay nice and crisp in an airtight container for at least a week. So that makes it a good gift. Okay, so then spread it out as evenly as you can on your baking sheet. And again, I'm not going to add the nuts yet since the peanuts that I happen to have on hand are already toasted. But if you're using raw nuts, this is the point where you'd want to add it. Okay, so the next recipe that we're going to do is really, really easy. It's called salt and vinegar pumpkin seeds. And it's basically like having salt and vinegar chips, but we're just using pumpkin seeds. So the way that we're going to get that vinegar flavor is that you soak the pumpkin seeds for an hour in the vinegar, and then we're going to pour it off. And then you can also make vinegar salt. So I went ahead and started soaking the pumpkin seeds about an hour ago. But to make vinegar salt, it's very easy. You just take a little dish, and this is going to make more than we need for the recipe, but it's kind of hard to make any less, actually. So we're going to use 1 tablespoon of salt. And a teaspoon of vinegar. So, you know, it's pretty cheap to make this. So if you make a little too much, it's not a big deal if you have extra left over. And then we're gonna do 1 teaspoon of vinegar. So just enough to get it wet. And then you're gonna let it dry, and that vinegar flavor gets infused into the salt. Oops, a little too much. Okay, so just gonna stir that together. And you know, if you accidentally add a little too much vinegar or something, you just then add a little bit more salt. So I added a little bit too much, so I can either pour it off or I'll just eyeball this. Do a little bit more salt. You want enough to coat the salt, but you want it to be kind of a paste. So then you can just let this dry for a day at room temperature, or you can put it in the oven. But just for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to let it dry at room temperature. So you're not going to see a whole lot happen over the course of this class, but what I'm doing is just kind of spreading it out. so that it can dry more quickly. The thinner layer it is, the quicker it'll dry. So if you leave it in a bowl, it might not quite be ready after one day. So I'm just going to set that aside. But I had made some earlier and I just kept it in a little spice container, and you can see it just looks like salt, but it has a little bit of that vinegar flavor infused into it. Okay, so since my oven is at a different temperature right now and I have something going on there, I'm not going to roast these, but I'll show you what they look like when they're done. So basically what you'll do is just drain off the vinegar into a colander. And I guess you could do that before you do the salt. You could use a little bit of this vinegar so you don't waste any. And now it has some of that vinegar flavor in it. And it also is wet so that the salt will stick to it. And so all you have to do is bake it at 350 for about 13 to 15 minutes. So it happens pretty quickly. So maybe if we have time at the end, I'll roast that. But you just want them to be lightly browned. So that's how it should look. They're pretty small so they can burn quickly. So just keep an eye on it and maybe give it a stir once or twice throughout the cooking process to make sure it's even. And that's it. So it's not going to be a super strong vinegar flavor, but it is a little bit more interesting than just eating plain roasted pumpkin seeds. So super easy. And other than the pumpkin seeds, very, very affordable to make. And so you might be wondering why pumpkin seeds? Well, they are rich in vitamin E, iron, magnesium, and zinc. And they also provide essential and unsaturated fatty acids. So most nuts and seeds are really packed with nutrients. So it's good to incorporate those into your diet when you can. Okay, so those are two kind of more savory things that you can make. The other question I was going to ask is about seasoning mixes. So another version of the pumpkin seeds that I've made in the past is Chex Mix flavored pumpkin seeds. So basically the same topping you would put on homemade Chex Mix, which usually has things like Worcestershire sauce and garlic powder and onion powder. You can put that on the pumpkin seeds and it'll give it a fun flavor. So spice mixes make a good holiday gift. So if you've made any spice mixes as a gift, then maybe you can share with us in the chat what you've made. Okay, so our last recipe is homemade peppermint patties. So let me make sure I can see everybody. So does anybody else here love peppermint like I do? You can raise your hand on Zoom. I love peppermint. I love using peppermint toothpaste and eating things with peppermint and chocolate, and just the smell of peppermint. It's to me, even not around the holidays, just all the time. I love peppermint, but I know not everybody loves it. I didn't see a whole lot of hands raised, but hopefully some of you still like peppermint. So you could use the same recipe and use other types of extracts too to get a different flavor, like maybe orange. So it'd be like an orange chocolate patty, which is a nice combination. This recipe, it's just kind of fun to make your own candies at home. It makes it a little bit more meaningful if you give it as a gift, and you have a little more freedom to customize the recipe. So this version we're going to use is from a website called It Doesn't Taste Like Chicken. It's all plant-based recipes, I believe, on that site. So the way that I'm going to make it will be vegan and also happens to be naturally gluten-free. So if you need it to be vegan or dairy-free, just check the labels on your chocolate. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to make the peppermint insides, and then we're going to melt some chocolate, and then we'll put it in the freezer to let it set. So you're going to take a baking sheet and line it with a silicone baking mat or parchment paper. So since the theme of this class is holiday gifts, these kind of baking mats make a really great gift. I use them all the time, pretty much every single week, at least once a week. And then there's no waste. You don't have to keep buying parchment paper. And they're really good at being non-stick. So you don't have to worry about the paper sticking to it at all, since there's no paper. Okay, so we're gonna set that aside while we make the filling. And so for the filling, we're gonna make it out of the vegan butter. And so it happens we're gonna use the other half of the stick. We need a 1/4 cup. And we're gonna use powdered sugar, and again, the agave and peppermint extract. Okay, so we're gonna use a little bowl, and we're gonna use a hand mixer to mix all of this up. So let's get everything all measured. So we need 3 cups of powdered sugar. I'm not gonna measure it exactly, but what you can do is put this down on wax paper, parchment paper, and level it off with a knife, but I'm just gonna eyeball it. Two, and I think I'm gonna have to open another bag. Okay, 3 cups of powdered sugar. And then I have my vegan butter over here. It's softened. It's been out of the refrigerator for about an hour. It's going to make it a lot easier. And I think I'm going to chop it up into smaller pieces to make it a little bit easier to combine. Okay. And then a 1/4 cup of agave. That's not my measuring cup. Okay, so a 1/4 cup of this again, and you want to use a light colored agave because you want the filling to stay pretty white. So you don't want to use any sweetener that's really dark colored. It won't look quite as nice. And for the flavoring, we're going to add a teaspoon of peppermint extract. Smells so good. Okay. So now we're going to use a mixer. So you can use a stand mixer if you have one, or if not, you can use a hand mixer. So since we're working with powdered sugar here, start it off real slow, or maybe even kind of combine it before you turn it on, because you don't want that powder flying everywhere, which might happen anyway. I picked kind of a small bowl. Let's see what happens. Combine it a little bit better. I'm going to mute myself because this is going to be a little loud. Okay. Okay, so I combined it for a little while and you can see it's still pretty crumbly. So it's probably gonna look pretty crumbly. So I'm just gonna get my hands in there and combine it. So I'm using my bigger bowl for melting the chocolate in a minute, but if you have a kind of a bigger bowl, then that would probably be easier when you're using a mixer. But you can see now it's really coming together once I get my hands in there and just squish it all together. So my next question for the chat is, have you made any homemade candies? And if so, what kind have you made? And we do have a few recipes for homemade candies on our Cookwell Berkeley site. One that comes to mind is a crispy rice bar. It's sort of like a crunch bar. And it's really easy. All you do is combine melted chocolate with crisp rice cereal. So it's just 2 ingredients. But so that's a nice starter homemade candy. It looks impressive, but it's really easy and it tastes really good. Okay, so this is forming a ball here now that I'm working it together with my hands. And then you can just kind of knead it a few times. I'm just going to knead it right in the bowl so I don't have to get out a cutting board or anything. But now you can see that it is nice and combined. It's a pretty solid, smooth ball. See? Okay, so yeah, pretty amazing. 3 cups of powdered sugar. There's a lot of air and it's very powdery, so it comes out to only about a cup or so of this mixture. Okay, let me rinse my hands real quick. Okay, so that's the first 15 minutes of cooking our snap mix. So we'll give that a stir. I'll use my little holiday oven mitts. So at this point, it should be looking pretty pale. It's just going to be kind of pale and wet for now. But it still has another 45 minutes to go. So we're just going to do this to make sure that it cooks evenly. It doesn't get too soggy in any one place. So spread it out nice and even on your baking sheet again. Okay. So now we're going to form the peppermint patties into little patties. We're going to use this cookie sheet here. And you want to do about a tablespoon for each one. So you can measure it out if you want, but you don't have to. I happen to have a mini cookie scoop, which I think is probably about a tablespoon. So this is going to make pretty big patties. So if you like them a little bit thinner, then you can do that too. So just roll it into a ball and shape it into a little patty. And I like them kind of thick, actually, so I'm going to leave mine pretty thick. But this scooper, if you do have one, makes it pretty easy because they'll all be uniform in size and it makes them pretty round. So if you do about a tablespoon for each one, then they should make about 2 dozen. Okay, so once this is done, what you're going to do is put these in the freezer so that they're nice and solid so that we can then coat them with chocolate. So you probably have to make a little bit of room in your freezer to accommodate this big old thing. So that will probably take at least 15 minutes or so. So let's see some of your answers and questions. And if you need the recipes, they are linked in the chat. Nicole put it in there, and it's also in the decal. So the cereal that I used is these multigrain spoonfuls. This is made with oats and whole wheat flour. So it's a nice whole grain cereal. Okay, so we were asking about other homemade gifts. So some ideas that other people shared are spicy pecans. That sounds good. I love spicy. Spicy roasted mixed nuts and popcorn balls. Those sound good. There was a question about how do you wash silicone mats? That's a little tricky. They're kind of hard to wash because they're flat and floppy. But I usually just put them in the dishwasher, like on the top rack, kind of fold it over and put it over the rack, or wash them by hand. And I just set them down on the countertop, and it kind of makes a mess, but I just scrub each side with the sponge and soap. And I get soap all over the counter, but then I just wipe it off. So they're a little tricky to clean, but I think it's worth it to have something reusable. What brand for vegan butter and vegan sugar? So the butter that I used for this is called Melt Organic Sticks. And they're about $5 a box for 4 sticks or 2 cups of butter. But I'd also like to use Miyoko's butter. It's dairy-free, vegan, and I find that works really well. It tastes really good, but it's a little more expensive. It's $5 for a smaller box, $5 or $6. So that one I try to save it for things where it really matters. Like for this, I don't think you can really taste the butter that much, so I don't worry a whole lot about it. For sugar, not all sugar is vegan, believe it or not. I mean, it's a vegan source, right? It's just from sugarcane or beets or whatever source. But sometimes it's processed using animal products to, I think, refine it. So if you're making this for somebody who's strict vegan, then you'll want to look for sugar that specifically says vegan. And for my purposes, I don't need it to be that strict, so I don't know that this is necessarily vegan. This is a Trader Joe's brand. It doesn't say, so that there's a good chance it is processed using animal products. Okay, what else do we have? Mom making fudge as a kid. That sounds good. Oh, somebody made our dark chocolate drizzled popcorn. That's an easy and fun gift. That's on our website. Peanut brittle, yum. Dessert soup. What's dessert soup? That sounds interesting. Okay, so almost done here. I think this mat, actually, I didn't even realize I was filling in the circles on this mat. I think this is made for making macarons. And I think there, yeah, are 24. So it's helping me space it out, keep things nice and neat here. Have a little bit left over. But these are actually going to be pretty big candies. They're probably twice the size of, you know, a York peppermint patty. So yeah, that's pretty much what these taste like. They taste like a York peppermint patty, but those are actually made with, I think it's egg and milk. So for somebody with allergies to either of those or that doesn't eat those products, then they wouldn't be able to have York peppermint patty. So we're making our own here. All right, so now we're going to get that in the freezer. to harden a little bit. Okay, I forgot to set the timer again on the snack mix, so we'll just give it another 5 minutes or so. Okay, so now those will be in the freezer for about 15 minutes, which kind of takes us right to the end of class. So I'll just show you how to, melt the chocolate, and we'll maybe do a couple at the end, but you don't need to see me do the whole tray or anything. So we can go ahead and get started on melting the chocolate. And what I've found is that you can just melt chocolate in the microwave and make this recipe and keep the peppermint patties in the freezer, and they'll be totally fine. But if you want to take this up a notch, what you can do is try to temper your chocolate. And if you've watched any of the baking shows, you probably heard them talking about tempering chocolate, and it's this whole complicated process. But I'm going to show you kind of an easy way to do it that you don't really need any special equipment. But basically, by tempering the chocolate, if you have a nice, good quality chocolate bar that you buy and you snap off a piece, it's shiny and the piece snaps off and it doesn't really melt in your hands right away, that's because the chocolate's tempered. So what happens is there's different types of crystals that chocolate can form. And we want those types of crystals that are in the tempered chocolate, because that's what gives it those desirable qualities. So if we just melt the chocolate, it doesn't quite work. But, a lot of recipes doesn't really matter. But since this is a candy, it's kind of nice to have nice shiny outside that doesn't melt in your hands. So easy way to do that is called the seeding method. And you really don't have to do this if you don't want to. You can just totally melt chocolate chips in the microwave or on the stovetop on a double boiler, and it's fine. But since we have time, I'm going to show you. So what you want to do is, first of all, buy the right kind of chocolate. So ideally, you want like a chocolate bar, a baking bar, or you might see different names, or like chocolate chunks versus chocolate chips. Chocolate chips are actually meant to hold their shape. If you were to make chocolate chip cookies, you don't want that chocolate to totally melt. So it doesn't quite work as well with chocolate chips. So what we're going to do is we're going to melt 2/3 of the chocolate, and then we're going to save actually 1/3 of it, and then we're going to toss that in at the end. So we need 1.5 cups of dark chocolate, we need 1.5 cups of chocolate. So we're going to start with 1 cup. So this is my 1/2 cup measuring cup. And then we're going to save 1/2 cup for the end. So we're going to go over to the stove now. And we're going to make a double boiler. So what you're going to do is put some water on the bottom of a saucepan. And then you're going to find a heat-safe bowl, like a metal bowl or a glass bowl, and you're going to put it on. And basically the steam is what's going to melt the chocolate. So you can't melt chocolate really straight in a saucepan because it'll burn. So this is a gentler way of doing it. And just make sure you don't fill up the pan all the way with water, because you don't want water touching the bottom of your bowl. So we're going to add 2/3 of the chocolate here, and we're going to melt it. And then basically by seeding it with the remaining 1/3 of the chocolate, it's going to encourage all of the chocolate to take on that crystal form that the tempered chocolate has. So I'm going to get my other 1/2 cup of chocolate ready over here. Okay, so this bowl is going to get hot, right? So make sure you use a pot holder. Okay, so it's time to give our snack mix another stir. So that's going to take a little bit to heat up. Let's stir our snack mix. So you can see it's starting to brown a little bit here. We're only about halfway done, so it's still kind of wet. And I think in the last, actually at this point, I'm going to throw in my peanuts. So again, I'm doing this now because these peanuts are already roasted off the bag. So I didn't want to burn them. But if you use raw nuts, you can add those in the beginning. And I think this mixture is still wet enough that it'll coat the peanuts a little bit. Okay, so again, spread that evenly onto your baking sheet. And we'll bake that for another 15 minutes, and we'll stir it again. My saucepan is making a little noise because the bottom was slightly wet when I put it on the cooktop, but that's all that's going on there. Okay, so you can see that the chocolate's starting to melt, but I just started heating this water, so this is going to take a minute. So while we're waiting for that to heat up, let's take a look at any other questions that we have. Question, what brand or does the hand mixer you have double as an immersion blender? Yes, let me show you. So this could be a nice holiday gift for somebody who likes to cook. So it's a hand mixer. It's not quite as efficient as those kinds that you have that have double whisks on there, but it has a few different attachments. So there's the whisk. It's also an immersion blender, which is great for making soups, especially like creamy soups in the wintertime. And then honestly, I don't use this one because I have a food processor, but it even comes with a blender attachment. So really handy, 3-in-1. Okay, water's boiling. So we don't want it boiling, we just want to simmer. So I'm going to turn it down and stir this chocolate. It's definitely melting now. Probably see that a little bit. You can also do the seeding method in the microwave. Just basically heat up the chocolate at 30-second intervals until it's melted, which for this quantity would probably take a minute to maybe a minute and a half. And then once it's all melted, then stir in your remaining 1/3 of the chocolate. And then the last thing that you have to do is you want the chocolate to be brought down to the right temperature, which is, I think it's about 90 degrees, a little less than body temperature. So what you can do, once you know that it's cool and you're not going to burn yourself, you can touch a little bit to the inside of your wrist or your bottom lip. And if it feels cooler than your skin, then it's probably close enough to that temperature. Okay, so our chocolate's all melted here. I'm gonna throw in the other 1/2 cup of chocolate. And that should be enough for it to take on that same structure. But if you do too much, it's probably going to cool down the chocolate too much and it's not going to melt. So this does take a little bit of work to stir it and really encourage it to melt. So you can see there, it's almost done melting already, actually, so it's not too hard. Okay, so there you have it. That's our seeding method for tempering chocolate. It's probably still a little bit warm, but in the interest of time, I'm going to show you how to coat some of the peppermint patties. Okay, we can stay right here. Actually, we're going to go back to the other counter because it's a little cooler over there. Whee! Okay. So here we have our little patties. You can see that they're pretty firm. They're cold and firm. And we have our chocolate here. So what you can do is use 2 forks to dip it in the chocolate and get it evenly coated. And then we're going to put it back on the baking sheet. Okay, so plop that in there. Sorry, you can't quite see this. I'm just turning it over in the chocolate. And you can kind of brush off the bottom so you don't get it pooling up too much. And then just drop it on your baking sheet. Sorry, I wish there was a better way that I could show you what I'm doing, but basically I'm just plopping the chocolate or the patty in there, flipping it over once, making sure the sides are coated with chocolate. And the problem that you often have with dipping things in chocolate is you get a whole lot at the bottom and it pools up and it doesn't look so pretty. So just try to scrape the bottom off on the side, and then what I like to do is kind of push it back towards where the chocolate you know, pooled on the bottom, and then it'll cover that up. So you just do this until you get through all of them, and then if the patties get too melted before you're done, just pop them back in the freezer until they're ready. So you can put these in the freezer to set, but I think technically also if you want this chocolate to be tempered, you want to cool it at room temperature. So it just takes a little bit longer. Okay, so there's a few of them, and the chocolate should cool pretty quickly because we're doing it on a cold frozen surface. So that makes it a little bit easier to cool down. And that is all the time we have. So thank you so much for coming to this class. I hope you got some new ideas for some homemade gifts that will just make your friends and family feel kind of special, and you can save money during these difficult times by making your own gifts. So check out the other ideas that we have on our Cookwell Berkeley site. And I'll stick around for a few minutes for any other questions. And I'd also like to show you some other gift ideas. So let me do that real quick before I finish the recording. Actually, sorry, here is the snack mix when it's done. It's kind of dark, but yeah, it'll just crisp up and it'll get a little bit browned. And you can tell, you can hear that. It's really crisp. I made this almost a week ago. So some other gift ideas. Silicone is a great kitchen material because it's non-toxic. It can go up to really high temperatures and it's really reusable. So in addition to the baking mats, I really like these lids you can put on something like this. And instead of using, oops, I'm making a mess, but instead of using, plastic wrap, and it's really cool actually. It holds on really tight there. You can tell it's tight because I'm lifting it just by the lid. They also make reusable bags out of silicone. So these are great for things that maybe don't quite fit in, reusable storage containers like a piece of pizza or something. These are really great for things like that. And another thing to use for a top is beeswax wrap. And we actually have a recipe of how to make this yourself on the Cookable Berkeley site. All right. Thank you for coming. I'm going to stick around for questions, so I'm going to stop the recording now.